In the dust-choked silence of forbidden archives, a document once surfaced that claimed the universe was engineered like a machine, not born like a miracle. Its diagrams spoke of ranks, functions, and failure points, as if reality itself had a user manual that was later erased. Why did ancient theologians argue over texts that described angels as administrators rather than saints? Why were entire books removed for naming celestial officials and crimes? Why does evil behave less like chaos and more like strategy? Why does humanity sit at the center of a war it barely remembers? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The air inside the Vatican Archives is said to feel heavier than anywhere else on Earth, as if centuries of suppressed knowledge have weight. Endless corridors stretch into shadow, shelves disappearing into darkness, each one sealed with wax, inked warnings, and institutional silence. Somewhere within those kilometers of shelving lies a fracture point in human history, a moment where reality stopped being described as a mystery and began to resemble a system. Not a myth, a structure, a blueprint. One text in particular, attributed to a 5th century thinker known as Dionysius the Areopagite, presents the universe not as poetry, but as administration. His treatise on the celestial hierarchy does not read like worship. It reads like an operations manual. According to this model, existence is arranged in layers, 9 ranks organized into 3 tiers, each with defined roles, authority, and jurisdiction. At the top are the seraphim, described not as winged cherubs, but as entities of pure intensity, beings whose function is perpetual alignment with the source, like furnaces that never cool. Beneath them are the cherubim, not cute infants, but repositories of total knowledge, living archives that store the informational memory of creation. Below them sit the thrones, less personalities than foundations, embodiments of cosmic law, comparable to the bedrock under a city that no one sees but everything depends on. This upper triad does not intervene. They do not answer prayers or perform miracles. Their domain is strategy, not execution. Beneath them operates the middle tier, a layer that looks uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has worked inside a large institution. Dominions oversee workflow and delegation. Virtues maintain the mechanics of reality itself, ensuring gravity holds, stars ignite, and time flows forward. Powers act as containment units, tasked with keeping destructive forces from breaching controlled boundaries. They are border security between order and collapse. Only the lowest tier interacts directly with the physical world. Principalities are assigned to nations and civilizations, shaping collective trajectories over centuries. Archangels manage critical missions, appearing at moments of crisis, delivering messages that alter history. Angels handle individual cases, assigned to single humans, observing, influencing, intervening when permitted. On paper, it is flawless, a perfectly tiered system where every entity knows its place, its function, and its limits, a cosmic clockwork with no room for error. And yet error occurred. The official explanation insists the system failed because one component developed pride. Free will, we are told, caused a malfunction. A single being chose self over source, and everything unraveled. It is a comforting story, simple enough to teach children, moral enough to preserve authority. But simplicity is often camouflage. Anyone who has ever designed a complex system knows that catastrophic failures rarely come from random rebellion. They emerge from built-in features whose consequences were never fully calculated. Free will is not a glitch. It is a feature. A system without the capacity for deviation cannot generate authenticity. Love without the option of refusal is not love. It is automation. Loyalty without the possibility of betrayal is not loyalty. It is programming. If the highest beings were created only to obey, their devotion would be meaningless. Choice had to exist. And once choice exists, dissent is inevitable. The unsettling implication is that rebellion was not an accident. It was a stress test. Within this framework, the first dissident was not defective, but necessary. He was designed to explore the limits of the system, to push against its constraints, and reveal whether allegiance was genuine or merely structural. This reframes the figure later labeled as Lucifer. His name, meaning light-bearer or morning star, carries no inherent malice. It suggests illumination, perception, the first point of awareness before dawn. Even prophetic texts that condemn him describe him as flawless, wise, adorned, positioned at the center of divine administration. A masterpiece does not seek to replace its creator out of envy. That narrative collapses under scrutiny. A being defined by logic and comprehension would not be driven by childish ambition. What, then, could motivate such a figure to resist an order that elevated him above nearly all others? Apocryphal texts, excluded from official canon, offer a different trigger. They describe a command issued to the entire celestial hierarchy: acknowledge and bow before a new creation. Humanity. Formed from dust, bound to decay, driven by contradiction. The command was obeyed by most, but not all. The refusal, according to these suppressed accounts, was not emotional. It was legalistic. It argued from precedent and design. A being forged of light questioned why it should submit to a creature of matter, why a system built on hierarchy would invert itself, why a volatile species, capable of destruction, would be granted authority over those designed to maintain order. The objection was not hatred of humans, it was fear of instability. From that perspective, humanity was not the crown of creation, but a variable, an unpredictable element introduced into a previously closed system. History, when viewed honestly, supports this concern. Wars fought over imagined gods, technologies used to exterminate rather than heal, truth inverted, lies institutionalized. The very freedom that defines humanity has produced extraordinary beauty and unprecedented horror in equal measure. If the dissident could see forward, even partially, the choice becomes tragic rather than evil. A calculation made under impossible circumstances, loyalty to the system versus loyalty to its intended outcome, obedience versus prevention. When warnings failed, opposition became the only remaining option. Thus, the conflict began not as a war of good versus evil, but as a schism over design philosophy. Preservation through control versus preservation through freedom. The result was not annihilation, but displacement. The battlefield shifted. Heaven was not lost. Earth was chosen. What followed is consistently misrepresented as a decisive victory. Ancient texts describe a war in the heavens, led by a commander whose name translates to "who is like God," a rhetorical weapon turned into identity. The dissident force was cast down. Curtain closed. End of story. Except the story never ends. If the opposition was truly crushed at the center of power, how did it become so influential on the periphery? Why does the defeated force operate with such effectiveness within human systems? Why does manipulation outperform intervention? The pattern resembles retreat, not defeat. A strategic withdrawal from direct confrontation into indirect influence. Earth becomes the new theater not because it is weak, but because it is valuable. Not as territory, but as a mechanism. Humans possess something neither side can manufacture: ongoing choice. Angels choose once, demons choose once, humans choose constantly. Each decision generates momentum, direction, energy. The conflict no longer hinges on strength, but on persuasion. The war, then, is not fought with swords or miracles. It is fought with narratives, incentives, fear, and hope. Every human mind becomes contested space, every ethical decision a micro-battle. And the original blueprint, the one locked away in archives and condemned as heretical, reveals an uncomfortable truth. Humanity was never meant to be a passive audience. It was the engine. The system did not break. It evolved into something far more dangerous and far more revealing. The aftermath of the celestial rupture did not resemble an ending. It resembled a reorganization. What had once been an open hierarchy operating under visible command became a distributed conflict, fragmented and concealed. Ancient texts describe a casting down, a fall from heaven, but the language is misleading. Nothing falls unless gravity allows it, and gravity implies a new center. The center shifted. Authority did not vanish. It relocated. Earth became the operational zone where influence mattered more than force. Direct manifestation receded, replaced by subtler mechanisms. The beings once described as luminous administrators transformed into unseen advisors, tempters, guardians, and adversaries. The battlefield narrowed from the vastness of the cosmos into the narrow corridors of the human mind. This was not retreat, born of weakness. It was adaptation. Accounts preserved in ritual manuals and forbidden reports describe encounters that resemble military debriefings more than spiritual visions. In exorcism transcripts, entities speak not in chaos, but in structure. They identify themselves by rank. They reference commands. They describe assignments. The language is procedural, as if extracted from a chain of command, rather than a nightmare. These records do not depict madness. They depict discipline. Opposing accounts exist as well. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, recount interventions by archangels who do not appear as abstract symbols, but as commanding presences issuing instructions, reinforcing morale, identifying vulnerabilities. These are not distant icons seated on thrones. They are field commanders moving between hotspots. The symmetry is disturbing. Both sides behave like organized forces locked into a prolonged engagement. This continuity exposes the weakness of the official narrative that insists the war ended long ago. A decisive victory leaves no supply lines. Yet influence persists. Ideas propagate. Systems erode from within. Cultures fracture along invisible fault lines. The methods resemble infiltration rather than invasion. That only makes sense if the conflict never concluded, only transformed. One side embodies absolute order. Loyalty is its strength and its limitation. Commands are followed precisely, without deviation. The other side thrives on deviation itself, exploiting loopholes, ambiguity, psychological pressure. One is a perfect blade. The other is a virus that learns. Neither can fully destroy the other without collapsing the environment they depend upon. This equilibrium produces a stalemate that mystics once described as cosmic balance. Balance is often mistaken for peace. In reality, it is paralysis. Neither side can escalate without destabilizing the system that gives their struggle meaning. Direct annihilation would erase the very resource both seek to influence. Restraint is not mercy. It is necessity. The restraint explains why human history unfolds as a series of oscillations rather than resolutions. Civilizations rise inspired by ideals of justice, sacrifice, and unity, then decay into cruelty, exploitation, and fragmentation. These cycles are not random. They reflect shifts in collective alignment. When compassion dominates, one spectrum gains momentum. When fear and domination prevail, the other advances. Humanity does not serve as audience or prize. It functions as generator. Choice produces output. Each act of voluntary creation strengthens one current. Each act of voluntary destruction feeds another. Coercion nullifies the process. That is why overt domination fails. Tyranny collapses into stagnation. Forced virtue produces no resonance. The system demands authenticity. Only freely chosen alignment carries weight. This requirement renders humanity indispensable and infuriating. Humans are unpredictable. Entire populations can pivot within generations. Empires collapse from internal contradiction rather than external assault. The variability prevents permanent victory. It also sustains the conflict indefinitely. Ancient strategists understood this intuitively. Religious institutions emerged not merely to transmit belief, but to regulate choice. By framing morality as obedience rather than discernment, they attempted to stabilize output. The simplification into rigid doctrine reduced volatility. Complexity was dangerous. Nuance empowered individuals. Power prefers predictability. That preference explains the systematic removal of texts that described the mechanics behind the metaphors. Documents that named roles, listed transgressions, or exposed internal fractures threatened control. Knowledge alters behavior. Behavior alters alignment. Alignment alters outcome. Suppression became policy. The Council of Nicaea exemplifies this shift. Under imperial pressure, competing narratives were filtered until a single authorized framework remained. Texts portraying divine authority as contested or flawed were excluded. Accounts granting humans direct access to hidden structures were condemned. What remained emphasized obedience, guilt, and dependence. The system stabilized at the cost of transparency. The result was not faith but compliance, not unity but uniformity. The deeper cosmology, preserved in fragments by isolated traditions, tells a less comforting story. It depicts a universe governed by laws rather than moods, a system where beings are bound by function and limitation, where conflict persists because no actor possesses absolute freedom or absolute control. Within this context, humanity occupies a paradoxical position. Physically fragile, temporally finite, intellectually inconsistent, yet uniquely capable of generating outcomes neither side can predict. This capability attracts attention, intervention, and manipulation. Inspiration and temptation mirror each other because they target the same faculty. Attention. Control of attention shapes perception. Perception guides choice. Choice fuels the system. Every narrative competes for mental real estate. Myths, ideologies, media, and symbols operate as delivery mechanisms. They encode values and trigger alignment without overt force. The battlefield is internal and continuous. This reframing strips the conflict of moral simplicity. Neither side emerges as purely benevolent. Both seek sustainability. Both justify actions as necessary. Both rely on humanity while resenting its volatility. The difference lies not in intention, but in method. One seeks alignment through submission, the other through seduction. Both limit freedom in different ways. The uncomfortable implication is that the war endures because it benefits its participants. Eternal conflict preserves relevance. Commanders retain authority. Structures remain intact. Resolution would dismantle hierarchies built around opposition. Peace would render generals obsolete. Humanity, meanwhile, absorbs the cost. Suffering becomes collateral. Progress is interrupted. Memory resets. Each generation inherits fragments without context. The cycle repeats because awareness remains incomplete. Understanding this does not confer immunity. Awareness alone does not end influence, but it restores agency. Recognizing the system as system rather than myth alters engagement. It shifts humanity from resource to participant. The blueprint was never meant to be hidden forever. It was buried to delay realization. The delay bought time. That time is expiring. The idea of a hidden rulebook governing reality does not originate from paranoia or modern conspiracy. It emerges from patterns that repeat across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. When independent civilizations describe similar structures using different symbols, the resemblance suggests inheritance rather than coincidence. Ancient mystics did not speak in abstractions for entertainment. They encoded observations using the only language available to them, story and symbol, compressing technical insight into myth. Among the most dangerous of these insights was the concept that reality responds to language. Not metaphorical language, but precise formulation. In early traditions, words were not passive labels. They were active forces. Creation itself was described as spoken into existence, not sculpted or assembled. Sound carried structure, vibration carried instruction. To speak correctly was to align with the architecture of the world. This belief appears in the opening lines of multiple sacred traditions. In Semitic cosmology, the universe begins with a command uttered into void. In Vedic thought, sound precedes form, with sacred syllables shaping matter like invisible chisels. Even Greek philosophy hints at this mechanism through logos, a term meaning both word and reason, suggesting that speech and logic share a common origin. If existence behaves like a system built on informational commands, then language functions as interface. This reframes ancient magic not as superstition, but as early experimentation with system access. The rituals were clumsy, symbolic approximations of something more exact. The real danger lay not in candles or circles, but in names. Across forbidden texts, the emphasis on true names appears repeatedly. A true name is not a nickname or label. It is a compressed description of function, frequency, and position within the system. Knowing it grants leverage, not because the entity submits emotionally, but because the system recognizes correct addressing. It is the difference between shouting into darkness and entering a password that unlocks restricted access. This explains why certain texts obsessively catalog names and titles. The long genealogies of angels and spirits are not devotional. They are directories. Each name carries scope and limitation. Each title defines jurisdiction. The act of naming becomes an assertion of understanding, and understanding threatens centralized control. The Book of Enoch stands apart precisely because it treats the cosmos as inspectable. Its author does not receive vague visions. He is escorted, shown mechanisms, introduced to operators. He records processes, punishments, and infrastructure. He describes storehouses of weather, the regulation of celestial bodies, and detention facilities for non-compliant entities. This is not allegory. It reads like field notes. Most destabilizing is the implication that humans can witness, and therefore comprehend, these systems. Comprehension leads to agency. Agency undermines dependency. A population that understands mechanics does not require intermediaries. That reality terrified institutions built on mediation. The same fear drives the suppression of grimoires. These texts do not worship demons. They document them. They list attributes, capacities, and limits. The Goetia, often dismissed as medieval fantasy, presents a rigid hierarchy complete with ranks, seals, and operational specialties. Chaos is absent. Order dominates. The structure mirrors the celestial hierarchy with disturbing precision. This mirroring suggests a shared origin. Both systems operate under similar constraints. Both obey rules older than allegiance. These rules govern interaction, authority, and consequence. Neither side invented them. They inherited them. That inheritance implies a deeper layer beneath the apparent conflict. A substrate where law precedes loyalty, where beings, regardless of alignment, must operate within defined parameters. Humans, uniquely, remain partially exempt. Their ignorance shields them from constraint while simultaneously making them exploitable. The exploitation hinges on belief. Belief shapes expectation. Expectation shapes perception. Perception influences choice. Choice feeds the system. Remove belief, and the system weakens. This is why propaganda eclipses power. Control of narrative outperforms control of territory. Religious schisms, ideological movements, and cultural revolutions function as recalibration events. They redirect collective attention and reframe moral priorities. Each recalibration alters output. The unseen structures respond accordingly. Influence shifts without visible intervention. The danger arises when belief ossifies. When narratives harden into dogma, choice collapses into habit. Habit produces minimal energy. Stagnation follows. Both sides suffer. The system requires fluctuation. It feeds on dynamic tension, not resolution. This requirement explains the persistence of ambiguity. Absolute proof would end belief. Absolute ignorance would render manipulation inefficient. The equilibrium is maintained through partial revelation. Enough truth to provoke curiosity. Enough obscurity to preserve control. Humanity exists inside that narrow band. Too informed to be innocent, too distracted to be sovereign. The tools for transcendence are scattered, incomplete, and contradictory by design. Mastery requires synthesis, not allegiance. Those who approached synthesis were labeled heretics, witches, or madmen. They threatened not heaven or hell individually, but the structure that binds them together. Knowledge of interfaces bypasses authority. That is intolerable, yet the knowledge persists. It survives in fragments, symbols, and instincts. Language retains power even when meaning fades. Names still resonate even when forgotten. Rituals still produce effect even when intention decays. The system responds regardless of belief. Modern society unknowingly replicates these mechanisms. Algorithms function as digital incantations. Code executes reality within confined domains. Interfaces mediate power. Those who understand structure shape outcomes. Those who do not experience results as fate. The ancient and the modern converge. Reality behaves less like a moral drama and more like a responsive framework. Ethics influence alignment, but mechanics determine consequence. Ignoring mechanics does not negate them. This realization does not offer comfort. It removes excuses. It places responsibility back into human hands. Choice becomes heavier when stripped of illusion. Yet weight implies significance. Significance implies purpose beyond exploitation. The hidden rulebook was never destroyed. It was fragmented. Reassembly is difficult, intentional, and slow. Each recovered piece restores a measure of autonomy. Autonomy destabilizes systems built on dependence. The conflict persists because resolution threatens all hierarchies involved. Awareness threatens the conflict itself. That is why it was buried, and why it keeps resurfacing. Long before doctrines hardened into commandments and creeds, there existed a category of beings that defied the neat division between loyal and fallen. They were neither enforcers nor rebels in the conventional sense. Ancient texts refer to them as watchers, a term that implies surveillance rather than authority. Their assignment was observational, a form of oversight intended to ensure stability during humanity's early development. They were positioned close enough to influence, but restrained from direct control, embedded within the system, yet deliberately limited. According to the oldest accounts, these entities occupied a liminal role. They were not architects of creation, nor were they executors of judgment. They functioned like auditors, monitoring compliance with cosmic law while remaining external to its outcomes. Their proximity to humanity exposed them to volatility the upper hierarchies never encountered. They observed desire, ambition, fear, and creativity firsthand. Over time, observation shifted into fascination. The transgression attributed to them is often reduced to a moral scandal, framed as lust or corruption. This reduction obscures the structural implications of their actions. What they actually violated was protocol. They crossed the boundary separating oversight from participation. By doing so, they introduced unauthorized variables into an already unstable system. The Watchers did not merely interact with humans, they altered them. Ancient narratives describe an exchange of knowledge that far exceeded agricultural tips or symbolic wisdom. Metallurgy appears suddenly, transforming societies capable of hunting into societies capable of mass violence. Astronomical calculation accelerates, enabling prediction, planning, and hierarchy. Symbolic systems evolve into operative frameworks. Humanity leaps forward technologically without the corresponding ethical infrastructure. This imbalance is critical. Knowledge without maturity amplifies consequence. Tools designed for creation become instruments of domination. The Watchers, in their attempt to elevate humanity, or perhaps align it more closely with their own perspective, destabilized the delicate equilibrium that sustained the system. The resulting offspring, often referred to as giants, represent more than mythological exaggeration. They symbolize hybridization, not merely physical scale, but functional deviation. These beings combined attributes that were never meant to coexist: strength without limitation, intelligence without restraint, appetite without empathy. Their existence strained ecological and social systems beyond recovery. Violence escalated. Resources collapsed. The texts describe a world saturated with blood, not as poetic metaphor but as environmental reality. The system approached critical failure. Intervention became unavoidable. The response is remembered as a flood, a global reset encoded into nearly every ancient culture's memory. Whether literal or symbolic, its function was corrective. It eliminated the most dangerous outcomes of the Watcher's breach, while preserving a core human lineage capable of restarting the process under stricter constraints. What followed was not forgiveness, but containment. The Watchers were neutralized. Some accounts describe imprisonment in isolated dimensions. Others describe binding through law. The language varies, but the implication is consistent. They were removed from operational capacity. Their knowledge, however, was not erased. Fragments survived. Techniques, names, symbols. These fragments circulated underground, preserved by those drawn to power outside sanctioned channels. Over generations, they evolved into esoteric traditions, demonized not because they were false, but because they bypassed authority. The fate of the Watcher's offspring introduces another complication. Their physical forms were destroyed, but their consciousness persisted in a degraded state. These disembodied remnants lacked the capacity to create, but retained the drive to consume. They could influence without manifesting. They became parasites of attention and emotion. This origin reframes the concept of demonic influence. Rather than fallen angels or abstract evil, these entities represent residual consequences of systemic violation. They are not aligned with order or rebellion. They are debris, unresolved errors lingering within the architecture of reality. Their behavior reflects this origin. They gravitate toward excess, compulsion, and fragmentation. They amplify instability because instability sustains them. They do not strategize on a cosmic scale. They infest locally, feeding on fear, obsession, and despair. This distinction matters. It clarifies why not all negative influence operates with intelligence or intent. Some forces act without purpose beyond survival. Lumping all opposition into a single category obscures this complexity and benefits those who prefer simplified narratives. The existence of these residual entities also explains inconsistencies within spiritual traditions. Not every harmful influence responds to authority. Not every ritual produces predictable results. The system is not clean. It contains legacy code, patches layered over unresolved faults. Humanity inherited this unstable environment. Bound by physical limitation, yet exposed to influences far beyond sensory perception, humans adapted through myth, ritual, and eventually institution. Institutions attempted to impose order where understanding was incomplete. In doing so, they hardened fluid systems into rigid frameworks. The suppression of Watcher narratives was strategic. Acknowledging them would require admitting that celestial oversight failed, that the system was compromised from within, that authority is fallible. Such admissions undermine legitimacy. Instead, blame was redirected. Responsibility was shifted onto humanity alone. Evil became a moral failure rather than a systemic consequence. This narrative preserved hierarchy while obscuring causality. Yet traces remain. linguistic artifacts, shared motifs. The recurring theme of forbidden knowledge appears across cultures not as coincidence, but as memory. Memory distorted, but persistent. Understanding this layer reframes humanity's role. Humans are not merely flawed creations struggling toward virtue. They are inheritors of a damaged system, navigating consequences they did not initiate. Their volatility is not accidental, it is adaptive. Choice, in this context, becomes remediation. Each ethical decision repairs or exacerbates underlying instability. Each act of awareness reduces parasitic influence. Each act of ignorance feeds it. The Watcher's legacy persists not as threat, but as warning. Oversight without humility becomes interference. Knowledge without restraint becomes catastrophe. Control without understanding breeds collapse. The system continues, not because it is perfect, but because it absorbs error and adapts. Humanity remains central not because it is favored, but because it is capable of correction. The blueprint accounts for failure. It always did. What was never intended was permanent ignorance. That, too, is a violation. As human societies rebuilt after the Great Reset encoded in flood myths, something subtle but decisive changed. The system did not return to its earlier openness. Access narrowed, interaction became regulated. Where once contact between realms appeared direct and frequent, it receded into ritual, vision, and rare intervention. This was not abandonment, it was containment. The catastrophe linked to the Watchers forced a redesign of engagement. Humanity could no longer be allowed uncontrolled proximity to higher-order entities or unrestricted knowledge. The solution was not isolation, but filtration. Information would still flow, but only through controlled channels. Authority would replace transparency. Intermediaries would replace direct perception. This transition marks the birth of priesthoods, oracles, and prophetic offices across cultures. These roles did not emerge solely from human psychology. They filled a functional gap. If communication with the unseen could not be eliminated, it had to be managed. The intermediary became both translator and gatekeeper, shaping messages before they reached the population. Over time, the role of intermediary hardened into institution. Institutions accumulate power by definition. They preserve continuity, but they also preserve themselves. The original purpose of mediation gradually inverted. Instead of facilitating understanding, it restricted it. Instead of empowering discernment, it enforced compliance. This shift is visible in the evolution of law. Early codes focus on balance and restitution. Later systems emphasize obedience and punishment. Morality transitions from relational to procedural. Right action becomes less about consequence and more about conformity. This suits hierarchical control. It also simplifies governance. The unseen conflict adapts accordingly. Influence no longer targets isolated individuals with overt experiences. It moves into systems, economies, ideologies, social norms. The battlefield scales. Persuasion replaces possession. Cultural inertia becomes the most effective weapon. Within this environment, myths of divine kingship proliferate. Rulers claim mandate from above, aligning themselves with cosmic order to legitimize authority. Rebellion becomes sacrilege. Compliance becomes virtue. This alignment benefits both visible and invisible hierarchies. Yet resistance persists. It emerges through philosophers, mystics, and reformers who challenge mediated authority. They do not deny the unseen. They question representation. They seek direct alignment rather than delegated obedience. Their ideas spread briefly, then are absorbed or suppressed. This pattern repeats with mechanical precision. A revelation destabilizes the system. Institutions respond by codifying it, stripping it of disruptive elements, and reintegrating it as doctrine. The original insight survives only in fragments, embedded in metaphor or art. Language plays a critical role in this process. Words shift meaning over generations. Terms once describing function become moralized. Angels become symbols of goodness rather than operators. Demons become abstractions of vice rather than residual entities. Complexity dissolves into polarity. This simplification serves efficiency. Binary narratives mobilize populations more easily than nuanced frameworks. They also obscure accountability. When evil is externalized as an opposing force, internal responsibility diminishes. Systems fail, but blame is displaced. The unseen structures capitalize on this displacement. Influence becomes easier when humans relinquish agency. When individuals believe outcomes are predetermined or externally imposed, their choices lose weight. Energy output stabilizes but diminishes. The system tolerates this reduction in exchange for predictability. Periods of stagnation follow. Civilizations ossify, innovation slows, corruption spreads. Eventually, instability returns, forcing recalibration. Revolutions erupt, both spiritual and political. Old narratives collapse. New ones emerge. The cycle resumes. Throughout this process, humanity oscillates between empowerment and dependency. Each swing leaves traces. Cultural memory accumulates but remains fragmented. Symbols persist without context. Rituals endure without understanding. The most dangerous remnants of Watcher knowledge survive in distorted form. Techniques divorced from ethical grounding resurface as manipulation. Control over attention becomes the primary objective. Those who master narrative shape reality more effectively than those who wield force. Modern systems refine this approach. Media saturation replaces myth. Algorithms replace omens. Influence becomes quantifiable. Yet the underlying mechanics remain unchanged. Attention directs alignment. Alignment generates consequence. The ancient warning embedded in forbidden texts becomes increasingly relevant. Power without comprehension accelerates collapse. Humanity now wields tools that reshape environment, biology, and perception. The ethical infrastructure still lags. This asymmetry mirrors the original transgression. Knowledge outruns wisdom. Capability outpaces restraint. The system approaches another threshold. The difference lies in awareness. Humanity now possesses partial understanding of its own influence. The myths are no longer taken literally, but their symbolic function persists. The unseen conflict adapts again, embedding itself within secular frameworks. Angels and demons no longer require belief to operate. They function through incentive structures, psychological triggers, and systemic pressures. The language changes, the mechanics do not. The blueprint continues to reveal itself through failure. Each collapse exposes another layer. Each crisis forces reassessment. Humanity inches toward comprehension, not through revelation, but through consequence. The intermediaries sense this shift. Authority erodes as access to information expands. Control mechanisms tighten in response. Narratives grow louder, simpler, more polarized. Fear becomes currency. Yet complexity cannot be suppressed indefinitely. Reality resists oversimplification. The system destabilizes when narratives diverge too far from experience. Dissonance accumulates. This is where humanity stands now, at the intersection of inherited damage and emerging agency. The legacy of the Watchers lingers not as myth, but as unresolved potential. The same capacity that once nearly destroyed the system now holds the possibility of repair. Repair does not require allegiance to any hierarchy. It requires discernment, the ability to recognize influence without surrendering choice, the willingness to hold complexity without retreating into certainty. The conflict persists because resolution demands maturity, not obedience, not rebellion, integration. The system waits. It always has. As centuries layered over one another, the mechanisms of influence refined themselves with quiet precision. What once required visions, apparitions, and overt interventions became embedded into structure. Belief systems evolved into social architecture. Morality encoded itself into law. Law crystallized into institutions that operated independently of their origins. The unseen conflict no longer needed to announce itself. It became implicit. Human societies began to mirror the hierarchies they could no longer perceive. Authority centralized. Decision-making abstracted. Responsibility diffused upward until individual agency blurred into collective inertia. The same tiered logic attributed to celestial systems reappeared in empires, corporations, and bureaucracies. Power flowed downward. Consequences flowed upward. The pattern repeated because it was efficient. This efficiency came at a cost. Distance between action and outcome eroded accountability. Individuals acted within roles rather than conscience. Obedience replaced judgment. When harm occurred, it was attributed to process rather than choice. The system absorbed blame. The individual dissolved into function. The unseen structures benefited from this arrangement. Influence scales more effectively through systems than through isolated minds. A single idea embedded in policy reaches millions without resistance. A norm established through repetition becomes invisible. Control achieved through habit requires no enforcement. This evolution explains the gradual disappearance of overt spiritual phenomena from daily life. Miracles became rare not because the system withdrew, but because it no longer needed spectacle. Influence achieved through environment is subtler and more durable. Humans adapt to conditions faster than commands. The battlefield shifted again, this time into abstraction. Ideologies replaced deities. Economic models supplanted moral codes. Value became numerical. Worth measured itself through productivity. Identity fragmented into roles, metrics, and profiles. The language changed. The mechanics remained. Within this abstraction, freedom appeared to expand while narrowing in practice. Choice multiplied superficially while outcomes converged. Consumption replaced creation. Expression replaced understanding. Noise replaced signal. Attention fractured. This fragmentation weakened resistance. A divided focus cannot sustain depth. Without depth, discernment fades. Influence thrives in distraction. The unseen conflict exploited this vulnerability with surgical efficiency. Narratives accelerated. Information overflowed. Contradiction normalized. Truth became negotiable. In this environment, certainty emerged not from evidence but from repetition. The loudest signal dominated regardless of coherence. The system did not need to lie. It only needed to overwhelm. Confusion paralyzes more effectively than deception. When everything is questioned, nothing is acted upon. Stagnation follows. Stagnation breeds anxiety. Anxiety seeks relief. Relief arrives in simplified explanations. Simplification concentrates power. The cycle reinforces itself. Humanity's technological ascent amplified this dynamic. Tools designed to connect became instruments of segmentation. Algorithms optimized engagement rather than understanding. Feedback loops rewarded extremity. Balance lost visibility. Yet technology also preserved fragments of suppressed knowledge. Archives digitized. Texts resurfaced. Patterns reemerged. The same forbidden concepts echoed across platforms once isolated by geography and gatekeeping. Suppression became impractical. This exposure created friction. Institutions accustomed to controlling narrative struggled to adapt. Authority eroded. Trust fractured. Competing interpretations proliferated. The system destabilized again. The unseen conflict adjusted. Influence diversified. No single narrative dominated. Polarization replaced orthodoxy. Division replaced consensus. Humanity fractured along ideological lines that mapped poorly onto reality, but effectively immobilized cooperation. In this environment, alignment became more difficult to sustain. Ethical clarity drowned in noise. Extremes consumed attention. Moderation disappeared. The system oscillated faster, generating instability without resolution. This instability resembles earlier collapse points. The difference lies in scale. Humanity now affects planetary systems. Ecological balance destabilizes. Climate reacts. Feedback accelerates. Consequences amplify. The original blueprint accounted for localized failure. It did not anticipate global reach without corresponding maturity. The system strains under asymmetry. Within this strain, ancient concepts resurface with renewed relevance. Balance, integration, stewardship. These ideas transcend ideology. They align with systemic stability rather than allegiance. The unseen structures respond cautiously. Escalation risks collapse. Restraint risks irrelevance. The stalemate tightens. Humanity occupies a narrowing corridor. Awareness increases without coherence. Power expands without wisdom. The gap threatens structural integrity. Repair requires reintegration of agency. Individuals reclaiming responsibility within systems. Choice reconnected to consequence. Attention reclaimed from fragmentation. Depth restored. This process cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. Coercion nullifies outcome. The system waits for voluntary recalibration. Signs of this recalibration appear sporadically. Movements emphasizing mindfulness, ethical technology, and regenerative practices emerge. They lack unified narrative. Their strength lies in decentralization. The unseen conflict observes. Influence adjusts. Pressure mounts. The blueprint reveals a final constraint. Systems cannot outpace consciousness indefinitely. When capability exceeds comprehension, collapse enforces recalibration. This is not punishment, it is correction. Humanity stands at such a threshold. The outcome remains undefined, not predetermined. The system does not dictate resolution. It responds. This responsiveness preserves significance. Despite manipulation, humanity retains leverage. Choice still matters. Alignment still generates consequence. The conflict persists because humanity has not yet integrated its role. Neither subordinate nor sovereign, but participatory. Not resource, but regulator. The system does not demand allegiance. It demands maturity. The next phase will not be announced with fire or revelation. It will unfold through accumulation of choices made quietly, repeatedly, without spectacle. The blueprint remains active, its outcome remains open. Across the long arc of human memory, moments of abrupt transformation stand out like fractures in stone. Civilizations that appear stable for centuries suddenly collapse. Belief systems that dominate entire regions dissolve within a generation. These ruptures are often explained through economics, warfare, or environmental stress, but those explanations describe triggers, not causes. Beneath each collapse lies a deeper misalignment between structure and consciousness. When systems grow more complex than the awareness of those operating them, failure becomes inevitable. This principle applies equally to machines, societies, and the unseen architecture intertwined with both. The ancient texts understood this intuitively. They warned not of punishment, but of imbalance. A system out of balance does not need an enemy. It destroys itself. The unseen conflict exploits imbalance, but does not create it. Influence amplifies existing distortion. Where fear dominates, it feeds fear. Where pride governs, it magnifies pride. Where apathy spreads, it deepens inertia. The system mirrors humanity back to itself, intensified. This mirroring is why the same patterns recur despite technological advancement. Empires rise claiming enlightenment, only to reproduce oppression in new forms. Revolutions overthrow tyrants and install bureaucracies. Ideologies promise liberation and deliver conformity. The surface changes. The structure persists. Ancient reformers recognized this trap. They did not attack institutions directly. They targeted perception. Their teachings emphasized internal alignment over external obedience, compassion over law, awareness over ritual. These ideas threatened both visible and invisible hierarchies because they reduced dependency. Such figures were tolerated briefly, then absorbed or eliminated. Their messages were sanitized, their lives mythologized, their warnings diluted into moral slogans. The system neutralized disruption without confronting its source. Over time, spirituality itself became abstracted. Practices once intended to cultivate awareness transformed into identity markers. Belonging replaced understanding. Performance replaced transformation. The unseen conflict adapted seamlessly. As belief weakened in traditional frameworks, new substitutes emerged. Nationalism, consumerism, and ideological absolutism filled the void. These systems functioned identically, offering identity, purpose, and belonging in exchange for allegiance. Their symbols differed. Their mechanics did not. The escalation of these substitutes coincided with unprecedented technological leverage. Humanity gained the ability to manipulate matter, energy, and information at scales previously attributed to gods. Yet ethical frameworks remained tribal. Power expanded faster than integration. This disparity reactivated dormant fault lines. Environmental degradation, mass displacement, and systemic inequality intensified. These outcomes are often framed as moral failures or political disputes. They are structural consequences of imbalance. The unseen structures do not intervene to correct these outcomes. Intervention would nullify choice. Instead, consequence accumulates. Pressure builds. The system seeks equilibrium through feedback. Feedback manifests as crisis. Crisis disrupts complacency. Disruption creates opportunity for recalibration. Whether recalibration occurs depends on awareness. Awareness remains uneven. Some individuals perceive pattern and adjust behavior. Others retreat into denial or extremity. The collective oscillates. This oscillation sustains the stalemate. Neither alignment dominates long enough to resolve tension. The system remains active, feeding on fluctuation. The ancient warning encoded in myth becomes clearer. Humanity was not meant to inherit power without understanding. The Watcher's transgression accelerated development without maturation. The consequences echo. Repair requires slowing without stagnation. Progress without acceleration. Innovation integrated with restraint. These principles resist mass adoption because they lack spectacle. Spectacle attracts attention. Attention fuels influence. Quiet integration starves the system of volatility. It is effective but slow. The unseen conflict struggles against slowness. It thrives on urgency. Crisis accelerates alignment. Calm diffuses it. Stability reduces output. This is why periods of peace often precede upheaval. The system destabilizes stagnation to restore flow. Humans mistake this for external threat rather than internal imbalance. Understanding this dynamic reframes suffering. It is not divinely inflicted nor randomly cruel. It is systemic correction amplified by misalignment. This does not justify harm. It contextualizes it. Responsibility shifts accordingly. Blame loses utility. Agency gains weight. Each decision contributes to alignment or distortion. The difficulty lies in scale. Individual choices feel insignificant against global systems. This perception discourages engagement. It is misleading. Systems aggregate micro-decisions. Culture is cumulative. The unseen structures operate at aggregate levels. They do not require universal compliance. They exploit trends. Small shifts can cascade. History confirms this. Minor philosophical movements reshape civilizations. Subtle technological changes redefine behavior. Incremental adjustments accumulate into transformation. The blueprint anticipates this. It embeds resilience through decentralization. No single point of failure exists. No singular savior resolves imbalance. Integration emerges collectively or not at all. This frustrates those seeking decisive intervention. The system offers none. It responds to alignment, not demand. Humanity's challenge is not choosing sides within the unseen conflict. It is transcending the conflict's framing, moving beyond submission and rebellion into participation. Participation requires literacy in consequence, understanding how actions propagate, how narratives shape behavior, how attention directs outcome. This literacy was once guarded. It is now unavoidable. Complexity forces engagement. Ignorance carries escalating cost. The system does not punish ignorance. It magnifies its effects. As pressures mount, clarity becomes survival skill rather than luxury. Discernment shifts from spiritual pursuit to practical necessity. The conflict persists not because humanity is weak, but because it is unfinished. Development continues. Integration remains possible. The blueprint does not predict failure or success. It describes conditions. Outcomes emerge through alignment. The next fracture will not announce itself as judgment. It will feel like consequence. And consequence is honest. The deeper the structure reveals itself, the clearer one pattern becomes. Control is never maintained through force alone. Force breaks what it touches. Sustainable dominance depends on consent, whether conscious or coerced through illusion. Throughout history, the most effective systems of control did not present themselves as prisons. They presented themselves as solutions. This is why the unseen conflict invests so heavily in interpretation. Raw events matter less than the meaning assigned to them. A famine can become a punishment, a test, a market fluctuation, or a sacrifice, depending on narrative. The body experiences hunger regardless, but the mind determines response. Meaning shapes alignment. Institutions learned this early. Rituals evolved not only to connect with the unseen, but to stabilize perception. Repetition dulled inquiry. Symbol replaced investigation. Over time, participation itself became proof of truth. Those who questioned structure were framed as threats not because they were wrong, but because they destabilized coherence. Coherence is currency. A coherent population moves predictably. Predictability enables management. The unseen structures benefit when coherence aligns with their influence. They suffer when coherence fractures into independent discernment. Independent discernment does not require rebellion. It requires literacy, the ability to read patterns without surrendering to them. This capacity has always been rare, not because it is forbidden, but because it demands effort without immediate reward. The system discourages effort through saturation. Endless stimulus exhausts attention. Exhausted attention seeks shortcuts. Shortcuts accept prepackaged meaning. Thus, control perpetuates itself without overt enforcement. This dynamic extends beyond religion into economics and culture. Markets rely on belief as much as material exchange. Value exists because it is collectively agreed upon. When belief shifts, systems tremble. Currency, reputation, legitimacy all operate on invisible consensus. The unseen conflict exploits consensus. Influence flows through shared assumptions. Alter assumption and outcome follows. This is why symbolic acts carry disproportionate power. They recalibrate belief at scale. The collapse of symbols often precedes collapse of systems. Flags lose meaning. Titles hollow out. Authority erodes. In these moments, chaos threatens, but so does renewal. The system responds cautiously, amplifying fear to preserve structure. Fear narrows perception. Narrow perception simplifies choice. Simplified choice stabilizes output. This feedback loop sustains control during instability. Yet fear cannot dominate indefinitely. It corrodes trust. Trust erosion undermines coherence. When trust collapses, narratives lose grip. The system destabilizes again. Human history cycles through these phases. Expansion, saturation, collapse, renewal. Each cycle compresses time. Acceleration increases. The system approaches thresholds faster. Modern humanity experiences this acceleration viscerally. Information travels instantly. Influence propagates globally. Local events ripple outward. The unseen structures adapt but strain under speed. Speed reduces reflection. Reflection restores agency. The balance between them determines alignment. Ancient practices emphasized slowness for this reason. Fasting, silence, retreat, contemplation. These were not moral tests. They were perceptual recalibrations. Slowing input clarified signal. Such practices threatened systems reliant on constant engagement. They reduced output volatility. They restored autonomy. Institutions tolerated them only when contained within approved frameworks. Outside those frameworks, slowness was dangerous. It enabled insight without mediation. Those who withdrew and returned changed, disrupted stability. This threat persists. Modern equivalents appear in movements prioritizing mindfulness, intentional living, and ecological balance. These ideas spread quietly, resistant to commodification. They weaken manipulation by reducing reactivity. The unseen conflict reacts by absorbing language without substance. Mindfulness becomes productivity tool. Sustainability becomes marketing slogan. Integration is simulated without altering structure. Simulation preserves appearance while nullifying effect. It pacifies dissent by offering symbolic satisfaction. The system excels at this adaptation. Yet simulation cannot fully replace experience. Cognitive dissonance accumulates. People sense emptiness beneath performance. This sensation drives further seeking. Seeking without discernment leads back into substitution. New ideologies replace old ones. The cycle continues. Breaking the cycle requires integration of awareness and action. Insight must inform behavior. Behavior must reinforce insight. Fragmentation between knowing and doing sustains imbalance. The blueprint emphasizes this integration. Knowledge alone destabilizes. Action alone exhausts. Alignment emerges from coherence between perception and response. The unseen structures cannot prevent this coherence. They can only distract from it. When distraction fails, influence wanes. This is why attention remains the primary battleground. Not belief, not morality. Attention determines what enters awareness. Awareness determines choice. Choice determines outcome. Modern systems monetize attention openly. This transparency reveals the mechanism inadvertently. Those who observe it gain leverage. Leverage does not require domination. It requires restraint. Choosing where not to engage conserves energy. Conserved energy deepens agency. Agency threatens systems dependent on consumption, reaction, and polarization. Resistance emerges not through confrontation, but through withdrawal from manipulative loops. Withdrawal does not mean disengagement from reality. It means selective engagement aligned with values rather than impulse. This selective engagement recalibrates alignment. Small pockets of coherence form. Networks emerge. Influence shifts subtly. The unseen conflict detects these shifts. Pressure increases. Narratives intensify. Extremes escalate to recapture attention. Those grounded in discernment remain less reactive. They observe without absorption. The system struggles to redirect them. This struggle does not end the conflict. It transforms participation. Humans cease to function purely as resources. They become regulators. Regulation stabilizes systems. Stability reduces volatility. Reduced volatility diminishes exploitability. The blueprint anticipates this outcome. It does not promise utopia. It promises sustainability. A system resilient enough to absorb difference without collapse. Humanity's role in this blueprint is not heroic nor tragic. It is functional. Conscious participants maintain balance. Unconscious participants generate fluctuation. The future hinges not on victory over unseen forces, but on maturation within their presence. Integration replaces opposition. This maturation unfolds unevenly. It resists spectacle. It spreads through lived example rather than proclamation. The system adjusts. It always does. But adjustment cannot erase awareness once integrated. The conflict persists, but its character changes. Exploitation yields to negotiation. Manipulation yields to limitation. The blueprint remains incomplete because it requires participation to finalize. No external authority can conclude it. Completion emerges through coherence accumulated over time. That process has already begun. As coherence slowly re-enters human behavior, another layer of the hidden structure becomes visible, one that institutions rarely acknowledge because it undermines the illusion of permanence. No system, celestial or terrestrial, is static. All hierarchies decay unless continuously renewed by relevance. Authority does not persist through age, it persists through function. Ancient cosmologies encoded this truth through cycles rather than timelines. Ages rise and fall, orders renew or collapse. Even the highest structures are subject to entropy. What differentiates collapse from transformation is adaptation. Systems that adapt integrate new consciousness. Systems that resist calcify. This applies equally to the unseen hierarchies. The idea of eternal, unchanging angelic orders conflicts with observable pattern. If humanity evolves in awareness, any structure interacting with it must evolve or lose influence. Stagnant authority becomes symbolic rather than operational. This explains why some ancient descriptions feel distant or ineffective today. Invocations that once produced results now feel hollow. Rituals repeated without comprehension decay into performance. The system does not respond to form alone. It responds to alignment. Alignment shifts with consciousness. As humanity's perceptual range expands, older interfaces lose fidelity. New forms of interaction emerge, often misinterpreted as purely psychological or technological phenomena. The boundary between inner and outer blurs. Dreams intensify. Synchronicities increase. Collective intuition surfaces through unexpected channels. These are not supernatural events. They are systemic responses to changing input. The interface recalibrates. Institutions struggle with this recalibration. Their authority depends on fixed interpretation. Fluid meaning threatens stability. As a result, they double down on certainty. Certainty becomes louder as it becomes less credible. This amplification accelerates decay. When authority relies on volume rather than coherence, trust erodes. The system loses efficiency. Influence leaks into alternative channels. These channels are decentralized. They lack formal leadership. They spread through resonance rather than instruction. Their weakness is inconsistency. Their strength is adaptability. The unseen conflict observes these shifts with caution. Decentralized coherence resists manipulation. It does not require unified narrative. It does not collapse under contradiction. It integrates difference. This integration reduces polarity. Reduced polarity diminishes volatility. Reduced volatility weakens exploitability. The system's energy dynamics change. Historically, such transitions provoke backlash. Old structures attempt reclamation through fear, scarcity, or artificial crisis. These tactics succeed temporarily. Long-term effectiveness declines. Humanity experiences this as turbulence. Institutions appear increasingly unstable. Narratives contradict observable reality. The gap widens. Cognitive dissonance grows. Dissonance forces choice. Either perception adjusts to narrative or narrative collapses. Increasingly, narrative collapses. This collapse does not result in immediate clarity. It creates vacuum. Vacuums attract substitutes. New myths form rapidly. Some replicate old patterns. Others explore new configurations. The system does not prefer specific myths. It responds to coherence. Myths aligned with lived experience stabilize. Those detached from reality fracture. This is why authoritarian narratives struggle in environments of high information flow. Suppression slows, but does not stop exposure. Exposure undermines coherence built on denial. The unseen structures adapt by fragmenting influence rather than consolidating it. Instead of one dominant narrative, many partial ones proliferate. Fragmentation preserves confusion without requiring consensus. Confusion maintains volatility. Volatility sustains the conflict. Yet fragmentation also creates opportunity. Individuals navigate between narratives, comparing, integrating, discarding. Discernment develops through exposure. Discernment reduces reactivity. Reduced reactivity conserves energy. Conserved energy deepens presence. Presence clarifies alignment. This sequence cannot be forced. It emerges through experience. Experience requires friction. Friction produces discomfort. Discomfort drives growth. The blueprint does not optimize for comfort. It optimizes for stability through maturation. Stability arises when participants can hold complexity without fragmentation. Humanity approaches this capacity unevenly. Some regions advance rapidly, others regress. The system absorbs disparity. Global coherence lags behind local coherence. Local coherence matters. Systems scale through nodes. A few stable nodes influence networks disproportionately. Influence spreads through example more than persuasion. This dynamic bypasses traditional authority. It frustrates hierarchical control. Influence becomes emergent rather than imposed. The unseen conflict cannot easily counter emergence. It lacks centralized leverage. It responds by amplifying noise, not structure. Noise saturates attention. Saturated attention diffuses focus. Diffuse focus weakens emergence. The battle over attention intensifies. Technology accelerates this struggle. Platforms reward engagement, not insight. Insight often reduces engagement. Systems optimized for profit inadvertently oppose coherence. Yet technology also enables connection beyond geography. Communities form around shared discernment. These communities resist easy categorization. They evade suppression by lacking uniform identity. This evasion mirrors ancient survival strategies. Knowledge preserved through dispersion. No single archive holds the whole. Loss becomes survivable. The blueprint anticipates dispersion. It embeds resilience through redundancy. Truth fragmented across perspectives resists erasure. This does not produce certainty. It produces robustness. Robust systems withstand stress. Brittle systems collapse. Humanity's challenge is cultivating robustness without rigidity, flexibility without fragmentation, coherence without conformity. This balance cannot be legislated. It emerges culturally. Culture evolves through art, dialogue, and lived practice more than policy. Art plays a subtle role. It bypasses defensive cognition. It encodes complexity emotionally. It transmits insight without instruction. The unseen structures underestimated repeatedly. Music, narrative, and visual expression recalibrate perception quietly. They restore depth where abstraction dominates. They reconnect individuals to embodied experience. Embodiment anchors awareness. Awareness grounds choice. Choice restores agency. Agency destabilizes systems dependent on passivity. Passive populations are predictable. Active ones are adaptive. The conflict persists because passivity remains widespread. Fatigue, distraction, and fear inhibit engagement. The system exploits exhaustion. Recovery begins with rest, not withdrawal from reality, but restoration of capacity. Capacity enables response rather than reaction. Reaction sustains manipulation. Response integrates awareness. This distinction defines the next phase of human participation. Reactivity fuels volatility. Responsiveness stabilizes. The blueprint does not guarantee success. It enables possibility. Outcomes emerge through accumulation. Humanity is no longer unaware of the system. Partial visibility changes dynamics irreversibly. The unseen conflict continues, but asymmetry narrows. Dominance gives way to negotiation. Control yields to influence. Influence yields to limitation. The system adapts. It always has. But adaptation now includes humanity as conscious variable. That inclusion changes everything. As the illusion of permanence dissolves, another assumption collapses with it: the belief that authority originates from position rather than perception. Across eras, humans were taught to look upward for permission, downward for obedience, and outward for validation. This orientation was never accidental. It preserved hierarchy by externalizing agency. Once perception turns inward, the architecture of control destabilizes. The unseen system responds to perception shifts more sensitively than to ideology. Beliefs can be inherited. Perception must be experienced. When enough individuals begin to perceive causality between attention, emotion, and outcome, influence loses invisibility. What was once interpreted as fate becomes feedback. Feedback alters behavior. Behavior alters alignment. Alignment reshapes system response. This is why awakening is not a singular event, but a gradual recalibration. Sudden insight without integration produces volatility. Gradual coherence stabilizes. The blueprint favors the latter. Historically, moments of rapid awakening triggered repression. Mystical movements were crushed, reformers silenced, revolutions redirected. The system learned that sudden clarity threatens structural integrity. It adapted by fragmenting insight into manageable portions. Fragmentation allowed partial truths to circulate without destabilizing the whole. Symbols replaced mechanics. Morality replaced comprehension. The core insight remained dormant. Modern conditions undermine this strategy. Fragmented truths reconnect through networks. Patterns emerge across disciplines. Psychology mirrors mysticism. Systems theory echoes ancient cosmology. Ecology reflects ethical interdependence. The convergence restores coherence. This convergence does not require belief in angels or demons. It reveals function beneath symbolism. Entities once personified now appear as patterns of influence. The language changes. The mechanics persist. Influence manifests through incentives, not commands. Systems reward certain behaviors and penalize others. Individuals adapt unconsciously. Awareness disrupts this loop. When individuals recognize incentive structures, they can choose whether to participate. Non-participation weakens feedback loops. The system recalibrates. This is why voluntary simplicity and intentional living exert disproportionate influence. They withdraw energy from exploitative cycles. They reduce volatility. They stabilize local environments. Stability threatens structures dependent on churn. Economic models reliant on perpetual growth resist it. Media ecosystems fueled by outrage amplify disruption. The unseen conflict aligns with volatility because volatility sustains engagement. Yet volatility exhausts participants. Burnout spreads. Disillusionment grows. The system faces diminishing returns. At this juncture, new forms of authority attempt to emerge. They present themselves as solutions to chaos. They promise certainty, security, and order. Their narratives simplify complexity into opposition. Loyalty is demanded. Discernment is discouraged. This pattern repeats predictably. It signals defensive consolidation. Systems sensing loss of relevance attempt to reclaim influence through escalation. Escalation accelerates decay. Force reveals insecurity. Coercion exposes fragility. Authority based on fear corrodes rapidly. Humanity witnesses this corrosion in real time. Trust erodes. Institutions fragment. Narratives contradict lived experience. The gap widens. In this gap, individuals either cling harder or disengage. Disengagement creates space for reconstruction. Reconstruction requires patience. Patience counters urgency. Urgency fuels manipulation. Slowing perception reduces susceptibility. The blueprint emphasizes timing. Premature action destabilizes. Delayed action stagnates. Alignment requires attunement to context. This attunement develops through embodied awareness. Mind and body integration grounds perception. Disembodied cognition drifts into abstraction. Abstraction disconnects consequence. Modern life privileges abstraction. Metrics replace meaning. Screens replace presence. This disconnection amplifies manipulation. Reintegration begins with embodiment. Attention returns to sensation, relationship, and environment. Feedback becomes immediate. Choice regains weight. Weight restores responsibility. Responsibility restores agency. Agency does not seek dominance. It seeks coherence. Coherent agents do not require validation. They operate from alignment rather than reaction. The unseen system responds to coherence by reducing pressure. Exploitation becomes inefficient. Influence shifts toward subtlety. Subtle influence requires consent. Consent requires trust. Trust cannot be forced. This dynamic constrains both sides of the unseen conflict. Extremes lose leverage. Middle ground stabilizes. Integration becomes viable. Integration does not eliminate difference. It contextualizes it. Diversity becomes resource rather than threat. This reframes conflict as information rather than opposition. Tension signals imbalance. Resolution emerges through adjustment. The blueprint's most misunderstood element lies here. Balance is not stasis. It is dynamic equilibrium. Movement continues. Correction remains possible. Humanity's maturation depends on embracing this dynamic. Fixation on certainty impedes adaptation. Comfort in ambiguity enables learning. Education systems historically resisted ambiguity. They rewarded memorization over inquiry. This preserved hierarchy. It also limited resilience. Resilient systems encourage questioning. They tolerate error. They adapt continuously. Signs of this shift appear in emergent learning models, collaborative governance, and regenerative design. These experiments remain marginal but influential. Influence spreads through demonstration rather than decree. Success attracts imitation. Imitation scales. The unseen conflict cannot suppress demonstration without revealing itself. Exposure accelerates awakening. The system chooses restraint. Restraint creates space. Space enables innovation. Innovation reshapes structure. Structure influences perception. Perception alters alignment. Alignment feeds back. The loop completes. This feedback loop represents the system's corrective mechanism. It does not judge. It responds. Humanity's challenge is sustaining coherence amid pressure. Pressure intensifies during transition. Old systems resist replacement. Resistance manifests as polarization, scarcity narratives, and manufactured urgency. Awareness diffuses these tactics. Diffusion requires community. Isolated individuals struggle. Connected individuals stabilize. Community does not require uniform belief. It requires shared values enacted through practice. Practice integrates insight. Insight guides practice. The cycle strengthens. The blueprint unfolds through these micro-processes. No single event marks completion. Progress accumulates invisibly until thresholds shift. The unseen conflict persists, but its influence wanes as humanity internalizes regulation. External manipulation loses potency. What remains is not victory, but maturity. Maturity renders domination obsolete. The system continues, balanced not by force, but by participation. And participation changes the rules. When maturity begins to replace dependency, the system reveals its final defense mechanism: identity. Identity is more powerful than fear because it feels personal. A person can reject a narrative, but rejecting an identity feels like self-erasure. Throughout history, the most resilient forms of control have not commanded obedience. They shaped self-concept. This mechanism operates quietly. Individuals are taught not only what to believe, but who they are. Labels solidify perception. Once identity hardens, information is filtered automatically. Contradictory input is dismissed without evaluation. Alignment becomes reflexive rather than conscious. The unseen structures rely heavily on this reflex. Influence embedded at the identity level bypasses rational scrutiny. It does not argue, it triggers. Emotional resonance replaces analysis. Loyalty becomes instinct. This is why conflicts escalate fastest when framed as identity threats. Logic collapses. Nuance disappears. The system harvests volatility efficiently. Entire populations polarize along artificial lines that map poorly onto lived reality. Identity-based control scales exceptionally well. It fragments society while preserving internal coherence within groups. Fragmentation prevents unified recalibration. Coherence becomes tribal rather than integrative. The blueprint accounts for this vulnerability. It treats identity as transitional, not foundational. Identity is meant to be flexible, contextual, and permeable. When identity becomes rigid, development stalls. Rigid identity resists growth because growth implies change. Change threatens continuity. Continuity feels like safety. The system exploits this attachment. Modern culture accelerates identity formation through constant categorization. Algorithms sort individuals into profiles. Marketing reinforces preference loops. Social structures reward conformity within identity clusters. Difference becomes suspect. This environment produces echo chambers. Within them, perception narrows. Feedback becomes self-referential. Reality bends to fit expectation. The system stabilizes within fragmentation, yet rigidity carries cost. It isolates. Isolation breeds anxiety. Anxiety seeks validation. Validation demands reinforcement. The loop tightens. Breaking this loop requires disidentification, not loss of self, but expansion beyond labels. This expansion destabilizes control structures because it restores choice at the perceptual level. Disidentification is often misinterpreted as apathy or indecision. In reality, it reflects increased tolerance for complexity. The ability to hold multiple perspectives without collapse signals maturation. This capacity undermines polarization. It reduces reactivity. It weakens manipulation. Historically, traditions emphasized this capacity through practices dissolving ego attachment, meditation, pilgrimage, vision quests. These experiences temporarily stripped identity, revealing perception without narrative. Institutions tolerated such practices only when they were contained, ritualized, and symbolic. Unregulated disidentification threatened hierarchy. In modern contexts, disidentification emerges through exposure. Travel, dialogue, interdisciplinary study. The Internet, despite its volatility, accelerates this exposure. Exposure alone does not guarantee integration. It can overwhelm. Without grounding, individuals retreat into stronger identities. The system exploits overload. Grounding anchors perception. It reconnects cognition to embodiment, environment, and relationship. Grounded individuals process complexity without fragmentation. Grounding practices appear mundane. Attention to breath, movement, nature, craft. Their simplicity masks their potency. They restore sensory feedback loops disrupted by abstraction. Abstract identity thrives in disembodied environments. Embodiment dissolves illusion. Reality intrudes. As embodiment increases, influence shifts. Narratives lose immediacy. Emotional triggers weaken. The system compensates by intensifying stimulation. Intensity exhausts. Exhaustion opens cracks. Through those cracks, awareness seeps. This process unfolds unevenly. Some individuals disengage entirely, mistaking withdrawal for liberation. Withdrawal without integration leads to isolation. Isolation breeds distortion. Integration requires connection. Connection without identity fusion. Relationship without dependency. This balance stabilizes perception. Communities experimenting with this balance emerge quietly. They resist labels. They prioritize process over ideology. Their cohesion derives from practice rather than belief. Such communities are difficult to manipulate. They do not respond predictably. They absorb difference without escalation. The system struggles to penetrate them. Historically, similar groups existed at margins. Monastic orders, philosophical schools, artisan guilds. They preserved knowledge through lived coherence rather than doctrine. Modern equivalents adapt to new contexts. Digital spaces host decentralized networks of practice. Their visibility fluctuates. Their impact accumulates. The unseen conflict responds by attempting appropriation. Language is co-opted. Symbols are commodified. Practices are repackaged. Substance thins. Discernment differentiates between simulation and integration. Simulation mimics form without effect. Integration produces measurable change in behavior and outcome. This distinction grows clearer as awareness matures. People recognize when engagement drains rather than nourishes. They adjust. Adjustment shifts alignment. Alignment reduces volatility. Reduced volatility weakens identity-based control. The blueprint anticipates this progression. Identity is scaffold, not structure. It supports early development, then dissolves. Clinging to scaffold inhibits growth. The system resists scaffold removal. It invests heavily in reinforcing identity narratives. Media cycles intensify. Polarization sharpens. Conflict escalates. Escalation signals diminishing returns. When pressure increases without corresponding compliance, strategies falter. Humanity witnesses this faltering. Old narratives lose credibility. New ones fail to consolidate. Fluidity increases. Fluidity is uncomfortable. It lacks anchors. Yet it enables reconfiguration. In fluid states, new patterns form. The unseen conflict adapts slowly to fluidity. Its tools rely on fixation. Fluidity dissipates leverage. This does not end influence. It transforms it. Influence becomes negotiation rather than coercion. Consent replaces compliance. Consent implies awareness. Awareness implies responsibility. Responsibility redistributes power. Power decentralizes. Decentralization stabilizes systems. The blueprint converges here. Not in domination or rebellion, but in distributed coherence. Many agents regulating through awareness rather than instruction. This configuration resists collapse. It absorbs shock. It adapts. Humanity approaches this threshold incrementally. Progress is fragile. Regression remains possible. The system oscillates. Yet identity-based control weakens with each successful disidentification. Each individual who integrates complexity reduces overall volatility. The unseen conflict persists, but its scope narrows. Influence loses certainty. Outcomes diversify. What emerges is not unity, but resonance, not sameness, but alignment amid difference. The blueprint does not eliminate identity. It contextualizes it. Identity becomes tool rather than cage. When identity loosens, perception clears. And with clear perception, choice regains its original power. As identity loosens its grip, another concealed mechanism surfaces, one far more subtle than doctrine or fear: time perception. Control over time does not require altering clocks. It requires shaping how duration is felt, remembered, and anticipated. The unseen system has always relied on this distortion because a population trapped in urgency or nostalgia rarely occupies the present with clarity. Ancient cultures understood time as cyclical, not linear. Seasons, stars, breath, and ritual reinforced rhythm. Action followed readiness. Readiness followed observation. This rhythm stabilized perception. When time accelerates unnaturally, awareness fragments. Fragmented awareness is easier to steer. The transition to linear time reshaped civilization. Progress replaced balance. Accumulation replaced sufficiency. The future became goal rather than possibility. This orientation enabled expansion, but it also introduced chronic dissatisfaction. The present lost value. The unseen conflict adapted immediately. When humans abandoned cyclical grounding, influence no longer needed patience. Urgency became leverage. Promises deferred meaning indefinitely. Fear projected catastrophe forward. Both displaced attention from now. Modern systems perfect this displacement. Deadlines compress decision-making. News cycles manufacture immediacy. Productivity metrics quantify worth through speed. Slowness becomes liability. Presence becomes indulgence. This temporal compression weakens discernment. Rapid decisions favor habit over reflection. Habit favors conditioned response. Conditioned response sustains manipulation. Time scarcity also fragments memory. When experiences overlap without integration, meaning dissolves. Events blur. Lessons fail to consolidate. History repeats. The blueprint treats time as medium, not enemy. Growth requires duration. Integration unfolds gradually. Forcing acceleration destabilizes outcome. Yet acceleration defines modern life. Technology collapses distance. Communication eliminates delay. Feedback becomes instant. The nervous system adapts poorly. Stress accumulates. Stress narrows perception. Narrow perception simplifies choice. Simplified choice feeds volatility. The unseen system exploits this loop. It amplifies urgency through perpetual crisis. Environmental collapse, economic instability, social conflict. Each narrative demands immediate reaction. Reflection is framed as negligence. This framing suppresses long-term thinking. Short-term fixes dominate. Structural causes remain unaddressed. Instability persists. Restoring temporal balance requires reclaiming the present. Presence interrupts urgency. It restores sensory feedback. Sensory feedback grounds awareness. Grounded awareness perceives consequence more accurately. It distinguishes signal from noise. Influence loses efficiency. Ancient practices emphasized this restoration. Sabbaths, festivals, fasting cycles. These pauses recalibrated time perception. They reminded participants that existence exceeded productivity. Institutions later weaponized these practices, stripping restorative function and preserving obligation. The pause became rule rather than refuge. Its power diminished. Modern equivalents re-emerge organically. Slow movements, deep work, digital minimalism. These practices resist acceleration. They recover continuity. Continuity enables memory. Memory enables learning. Learning enables adaptation. Adaptation threatens rigid systems. Systems dependent on constant output resist pause. They label rest as laziness, reflection as weakness. The unseen conflict aligns with acceleration because acceleration maximizes volatility. Volatility sustains engagement. Engagement sustains influence. Yet acceleration produces diminishing returns. Burnout spreads. Productivity declines. Meaning erodes. The system faces saturation. Saturation forces recalibration. Either systems slow or collapse. Collapse enforces slowness brutally. Integration through collapse is costly. The blueprint favors voluntary slowing. Voluntary slowing preserves agency. It enables redesign rather than repair. Humanity senses this intuitively. Interest in mindfulness, nature immersion, and contemplative practice rises during periods of crisis. These are adaptive responses, not escapism. The unseen structures respond by commodifying slowness. Wellness becomes industry. Mindfulness becomes productivity tool. Restoration is simulated without reducing acceleration. Simulation pacifies demand temporarily. Eventually, its emptiness surfaces. Individuals feel unrest despite compliance, as they seek deeper integration. This seeking shifts perception of time again. Moments regain density. Attention lengthens. Experience deepens. Deep experience integrates memory. Integrated memory informs future action. Action becomes deliberate rather than reactive. This shift reduces manipulability. Urgency loses hold. Fear projections lose potency. The present anchors choice. Anchored choice stabilizes alignment. Stability reduces volatility. The unseen conflict weakens accordingly. Time perception also reframes mortality. When life is rushed, death terrifies. When life is present, death contextualizes. Fear diminishes. Fear fuels manipulation. Reduced fear undermines leverage. Ancient wisdom emphasized mortality awareness for this reason, not to induce despair, but to sharpen presence. Impermanence clarifies value. Modern culture avoids mortality. It distracts with consumption. This avoidance sustains anxiety. Anxiety sustains urgency. Reintegrating mortality awareness restores proportion. Crises shrink. Priorities clarify. Choice aligns with values rather than impulse. The blueprint integrates time, identity, and agency. Each influences the others. Restoring one facilitates restoration of the rest. This integration cannot be mandated. It emerges through lived practice. Communities modeling balanced time perception influence culture quietly. Such communities resist acceleration without rejecting progress. They innovate within rhythm. They align productivity with sustainability. The unseen conflict observes these developments warily. Its strategies adapt but lose efficiency. Influence becomes less predictable. Predictability sustains control. Unpredictability challenges it. Humans reclaiming time introduce unpredictability rooted in awareness rather than chaos. This distinction matters. Conscious unpredictability resists exploitation. The system adjusts by offering new accelerants. Novelty cycles shorten. Distraction intensifies. Attention fragments. Those grounded in presence navigate novelty without absorption. They sample without surrender. Influence dissipates. This capacity spreads slowly. It resists viral adoption. It grows through mentorship and example. The blueprint favors this growth pattern. It prioritizes resilience over speed. depth over reach. Humanity's maturation unfolds within this temporal recalibration. Progress measured not by output, but by coherence. Coherence stabilizes systems. Stabilized systems reduce conflict intensity. The unseen conflict does not end, it transforms. Its role shifts from exploitation to constraint. Constraint preserves balance. Balance sustains continuity. Time, once distorted, realigns, and in realigned time, choice regains its full dimension. When time begins to settle and identity softens, the final lever of influence becomes visible. Meaning. Meaning is not belief. It is not narrative. It is the felt sense that actions matter within a larger context. Control over meaning determines whether effort becomes devotion or exhaustion. The unseen system has always understood this distinction. Meaning operates beneath ideology. Two people can hold opposing beliefs, yet draw strength from the same sense of purpose. Conversely, millions can share doctrine and feel empty. Emptiness weakens coherence. Coherence depends on lived significance, not declared values. Historically, meaning was embedded in participation. Survival required contribution. Craft connected effort to outcome. Ritual aligned individual action with communal rhythm. These structures grounded purpose in daily life. The unseen conflict had limited access because meaning arose locally. As societies scaled, meaning abstracted. Work separated from outcome. Effort disconnected from visible consequence. Individuals contributed to systems too large to perceive. Purpose thinned. The gap filled with substitutes. Institutions offered meaning through affiliation. Nation, religion, ideology, profession. Identity supplied belonging. Belonging simulated purpose. Simulation sustained engagement without fulfillment. This substitution proved effective. People labored intensely for symbols rather than substance. Sacrifice detached from comprehension. Systems grew powerful. Individuals grew fatigued. Fatigue erodes meaning faster than doubt. Doubt invites inquiry. Fatigue invites surrender. The unseen system exploits surrender. When meaning collapses, distraction becomes refuge. Consumption anesthetizes. Entertainment numbs. Engagement continues without depth. Depth threatens manipulation. It anchors perception in experience rather than promise. Promises fuel future orientation. Experience grounds present awareness. Modern life privileges promise. Achievement, success, salvation deferred. The present becomes instrument rather than value. Meaning migrates forward indefinitely. This migration destabilizes motivation. When fulfillment is always later, effort becomes hollow. Burnout spreads. Cynicism follows. Cynicism is not rebellion. It is resignation. Resignation sustains systems by lowering resistance. Disengaged individuals comply passively. Volatility reduces. Output stabilizes. Yet passive stability carries hidden cost. Creativity declines. Adaptation slows. Systems ossify. Resilience weakens. The blueprint anticipates this. Meaning must be renewed continuously. It cannot be stockpiled or outsourced. Renewal requires participation in something tangible. Tangible meaning emerges through impact, seeing consequence, feeling contribution, witnessing change. These experiences restore agency. Agency reactivates alignment. Alignment strengthens coherence. Coherence resists exploitation. This is why small-scale action exerts disproportionate influence. Local projects restore visible feedback. Community initiatives reconnect effort and outcome. Purpose regenerates. The unseen conflict struggles here. Local meaning resists abstraction. It cannot be easily monetized or redirected. Influence dissipates. Global systems counter by scaling narratives. They frame local action as insignificant. They emphasize magnitude over immediacy. Discouragement follows. Discouragement preserves dependency. Dependency sustains hierarchy. The blueprint counters this by redefining significance. Scale matters less than coherence. A small aligned action stabilizes systems more effectively than massive misaligned effort. This principle appears across disciplines. In ecology, keystone species regulate entire environments despite limited numbers. In networks, critical nodes influence flow disproportionately. In human systems, coherent individuals catalyze change. The unseen structures recognize this threat. They target meaning through nihilism and absolutism. Nihilism dissolves purpose entirely. Absolutism constricts it rigidly. Both neutralize adaptive meaning. Between them lies integration, meaning grounded in process rather than outcome. Purpose expressed through engagement rather than identity. This integration reframes success. Success becomes alignment rather than accumulation. Progress measured through coherence rather than conquest. Such reframing undermines exploitative incentives. Systems optimized for extraction lose relevance. Regenerative models gain traction. Regeneration requires patience. It yields gradual return rather than immediate profit. Short-term systems resist it. Resistance manifests as skepticism, ridicule, or suppression. These tactics delay but do not prevent adoption. Regenerative practices persist because they restore meaning experientially. Experience trumps argument. People drawn to meaning through lived benefit cannot be easily redirected. The unseen conflict shifts tactics. It attempts to appropriate language of regeneration. Sustainability slogans proliferate. Purpose becomes branding. Substance thins. Discernment differentiates genuine regeneration from performance. Performance feels draining. Regeneration feels nourishing. The body recognizes the difference. Embodied recognition bypasses ideology. It guides choice intuitively. Influence loses precision. This intuitive discernment spreads quietly. It does not announce itself. It operates through preference rather than protest. Preference shapes markets. Markets shape systems. Systems adapt. Adaptation accelerates when meaning aligns with viability. Practices that sustain both people and environment outcompete those that extract. This transition appears incremental. It is cumulative. The blueprint does not oppose scale. It reorders it. Scale emerges from coherence rather than enforcement. Expansion follows stability. Humanity's maturation hinges on this reordering. When meaning grounds action, alignment stabilizes. The unseen conflict becomes less relevant. It does not disappear. It transforms into boundary condition rather than driver. Influence constrains extremes rather than exploiting them. Meaning anchors humanity within this constraint. It restores context. Actions resonate within a larger whole. This resonance reduces isolation. Isolation fuels manipulation. Connection diffuses it. Connection here does not mean uniformity. It means interdependence recognized consciously. Diversity integrated without fragmentation. The blueprint reaches completion through this recognition, not through victory, but through viability. Systems that sustain themselves persist. Those that exhaust collapse. Humanity's role is not to defeat unseen forces, but to outgrow exploitability. Maturity renders manipulation obsolete. Meaning is the final threshold. Without it, Awareness drifts. With it, awareness integrates. Integration stabilizes choice. Choice shapes outcome. Outcome feeds system. The cycle closes. What remains is not certainty, but continuity. And continuity is enough. With meaning restored as lived experience rather than distant promise, the system begins to behave differently. Pressure that once felt external reveals itself as internal mismatch. Resistance that once targeted authority redirects toward incongruence. Humanity stops pushing against walls and starts adjusting posture. This subtle shift marks a critical transition. The unseen conflict has always depended on misalignment between perception and action. When people act against their own understanding, energy fractures. Fractured energy is volatile. Volatility sustains manipulation. Alignment closes this gap. Alignment does not imply moral perfection. It implies coherence between intention, behavior, and consequence. A coherent action carries less excess energy. It resolves rather than amplifies tension. This principle explains why small acts of integrity feel stabilizing even amid chaos. They reduce internal noise. Reduced noise clarifies perception. Clarified perception informs next action. The feedback loop tightens. Systems respond to this tightening. Structures built on exploiting fragmentation encounter resistance without confrontation. They fail to extract surplus attention. Engagement declines. Declining engagement triggers escalation attempts. Narratives intensify. Stakes inflate. Everything becomes urgent. The system seeks to reopen fractures. This escalation feels overwhelming. Yet its intensity signals weakness. It reveals dependence on reaction. Humans grounded in coherence perceive escalation differently. They register it as signal rather than command. They respond selectively. Influence dissipates. Selective response reshapes collective behavior. Trends shift. Metrics change. Systems recalibrate. This recalibration often appears as dysfunction before stabilization. Old mechanisms falter. New ones lack polish. Transition periods feel disorderly. Disorder is often mistaken for failure. In reality, it reflects reconfiguration. When rigid structures loosen, components move. Movement precedes integration. The unseen conflict adapts reluctantly. Its advantage lies in exploiting rigid patterns. Fluid environments reduce predictability. Prediction underpins control. To restore predictability, systems attempt standardization. Uniform solutions. Simplified frameworks. These strategies struggle against diversity of context. Contextual intelligence grows as awareness spreads. People recognize that solutions are local, not universal. They experiment. They iterate. Iteration produces learning. Learning accelerates adaptation. Adaptation outpaces centralized control. This dynamic mirrors biological evolution. Decentralized variation outcompetes monolithic design in changing environments. The blueprint reflects this logic. The blueprint was never about enforcing order. It was about sustaining viability. Viability depends on adaptability. Adaptability emerges from distributed agency. Many small adjustments outperform singular directives. Humanity's historical reliance on saviors delayed this realization. Waiting for external rescue preserved dependency. Dependency sustained hierarchy. As savior narratives lose credibility, agency redistributes. Responsibility shifts from figures to networks. Networks stabilize through shared practice. Practice replaces proclamation. What people do matters more than what they claim. Systems adjust accordingly. This transition reduces susceptibility to symbolic manipulation. Symbols lose potency without behavioral reinforcement. Influence weakens. The unseen conflict attempts to co-opt practice by institutionalizing it prematurely. Processes ossify. Innovation stalls. Awareness counters this by valuing process over structure. Flexibility becomes norm. Rigidity signals misalignment. This sensitivity spreads. People notice when systems demand compliance without offering meaning. They disengage. Disengagement does not equal apathy. It redirects energy toward alternatives. Alternatives proliferate. Proliferation fragments old monopolies. Choice increases. Competition shifts from dominance to relevance. Relevance depends on resonance. Resonance depends on coherence. Coherence depends on alignment. The loop closes again. This phase challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about power. Power no longer resides solely in accumulation. It resides in coordination. Coordination does not require central command. It emerges from shared values enacted through consistent behavior. The unseen conflict struggles to operate in coordinated environments without hierarchy. Its leverage diminishes. This does not eliminate conflict. It localizes it. Tension becomes informative rather than destructive. Informative tension guides adjustment. Destructive tension demands release. Release often took the form of war historically. War discharged accumulated volatility. It reset systems brutally. Modern humanity cannot afford such resets. Scale magnifies cost. Alternatives become necessity. Coherent coordination offers such an alternative. It dissipates volatility continuously rather than episodically. Continuous dissipation stabilizes systems. Stability reduces need for extreme intervention. The blueprint anticipates this evolution. It embeds mechanisms for gradual correction. Humanity activates them through awareness. This activation does not require consensus. It requires critical mass. Enough participants aligned to influence networks. Critical mass emerges unpredictably. It depends on timing, context, and readiness. The system cannot force it. Signs of approach include increased sensitivity to hypocrisy, declining tolerance for performative authority, and rising demand for authenticity. Authenticity disrupts control. It resists scripting. It adapts fluidly. The unseen conflict attempts to simulate authenticity. Simulation lacks depth. It collapses under sustained scrutiny. Scrutiny increases as discernment spreads. People trust experience over rhetoric, metrics over claims. This shift alters leadership. Leaders become facilitators rather than commanders. Influence flows through credibility rather than position. Credibility requires coherence. Incoherence erodes trust rapidly. Systems adapt or lose relevance. This environment favors transparency. Hidden mechanisms struggle to persist. Exposure accelerates. The unseen conflict adapts by retreating into subtler layers. Influence becomes ambient rather than directive. Boundaries replace commands. Boundaries guide behavior without coercion. They define limits. Within limits, freedom expands. This configuration balances autonomy and stability. It reflects mature systems. Humanity approaches this configuration unevenly. Regression remains possible. Pressure fluctuates. Yet once coherence becomes experiential, it cannot be fully unlearned. Memory persists. The blueprint counts on this persistence. It does not rush. It accumulates. Each aligned action reinforces structure. Each misaligned action provides feedback. Feedback informs adjustment. Adjustment restores balance. The conflict evolves into constraint rather than opposition. It sets limits rather than extracting energy. Limits protect viability. They prevent collapse. This transformation does not feel dramatic. It feels subtle, ordinary, quietly effective. That quiet effectiveness marks maturity, and maturity reshapes the system from within. As the system recalibrates around coherence rather than coercion, one final misconception dissolves: the belief that resolution must arrive as a conclusion. Human storytelling favors endings. Conflicts are meant to be won, mysteries solved, enemies defeated. Yet the architecture underlying existence does not resolve itself through closure. It sustains itself through continuity. Continuity is often mistaken for stagnation. In reality, it is adaptive persistence. A river does not end conflict with its banks. It shapes them over time. Stability emerges not through dominance, but through relationship. The unseen conflict follows this same logic. It was never designed to be eliminated. It functions as pressure, defining boundaries and exposing imbalance. Without pressure, systems drift into entropy. Without resistance, agency atrophies. What changes is not the presence of tension, but its role. Tension ceases to extract energy and begins to provide information. Information guides adjustment. Adjustment preserves viability. This reframing alters humanity's relationship with adversity. Challenges are no longer interpreted solely as threats or tests. They become feedback. Feedback is actionable. It invites response rather than reaction. Reaction feeds volatility. Response integrates awareness. The maturity emerging within human systems reflects this shift. Individuals increasingly distinguish between stimuli and signals. Not everything requires engagement. Not every conflict demands resolution. Discernment filters input. Filtered input conserves energy. Conserved energy enables depth. Depth supports integration. Integration transforms identity from fixed narrative into fluid context. Individuals participate in multiple systems without fragmentation. Roles become expressions rather than definitions. This flexibility weakens manipulation. Manipulation relies on predictable identity attachment. Fluid identity resists capture. Institutions struggle with this fluidity. Their frameworks depend on stable categories. As categories blur, authority must adapt or erode. Adaptation favors decentralization. Decision-making distributes. Accountability localizes. Systems grow resilient. Resilience does not eliminate failure. It absorbs failure without collapse. Failure becomes learning. Learning cycles accelerate. Feedback loops tighten. Correction becomes continuous. This continuous correction marks the functional endpoint of the blueprint. Not perfection, but self-regulation. Self-regulation operates without oversight. It relies on internal coherence rather than external enforcement. The unseen conflict becomes embedded within this regulatory function. Its influence constrains extremes. It signals deviation. It loses exploitative capacity. This transformation does not require agreement on metaphysics. Whether one frames the unseen as angels, algorithms, or emergent patterns is secondary. Function matters more than interpretation. Functionally, humanity transitions from passive component to active regulator. This role demands responsibility. Responsibility shifts emphasis from blame to causality. Understanding how actions propagate replaces moral judgment. Ethics evolve from rules to consequences. Consequences anchor behavior in reality. Reality resists abstraction. Abstraction facilitates manipulation. Grounded ethics align action with impact. Impact informs adjustment. The loop stabilizes. This stabilization does not produce uniform outcomes. Diversity persists. Variation enriches adaptation. The blueprint favors diversity. Monoculture collapses under stress. Variety absorbs shock. Human cultures rediscover this principle organically. Local solutions gain prominence. Global frameworks loosen. Collaboration replaces compliance. Collaboration operates on trust. Trust emerges from transparency. Transparency demands vulnerability. Vulnerability counters domination. It exposes dependency. Systems that exploit conceal vulnerability. Systems that integrate acknowledge it. Acknowledgement redistributes power. Power shared stabilizes networks. The unseen conflict recedes into background conditions. It no longer drives narrative. It informs boundaries. Boundaries define safe operating space. Within them, creativity flourishes. Creativity expresses alignment dynamically. It tests possibilities without threatening stability. Historically, creativity was often co-opted or suppressed. It destabilized rigid systems. In adaptive systems, creativity becomes asset. Modern humanity witnesses resurgence of creative integration. Art, science, and ethics converge. Disciplines cross-pollinate. Cross-pollination accelerates insight. Insight informs practice. Practice reinforces coherence. The cycle reinforces itself. This phase challenges humanity to relinquish nostalgia for dramatic resolution. No final battle arrives. No singular revelation concludes the process. Instead, progress unfolds through countless small integrations. Choices accumulate. Patterns shift. This subtlety frustrates those seeking certainty. Yet certainty was always illusion. Stability arises from responsiveness, not prediction. The blueprint never promised answers. It offered capacity. Capacity to perceive. Capacity to adjust. Capacity to participate consciously. These capacities mature through use. Neglected, they atrophy. Exercised, they stabilize systems. Humanity's long struggle was not against external forces alone, but against its own fragmentation. Integration heals that fragmentation. Integration does not erase difference. It contextualizes it within a coherent whole. The unseen conflict transforms accordingly. It no longer frames itself as opposition. It functions as boundary condition. Boundary conditions preserve integrity. They prevent runaway dynamics. They maintain balance. Balance here is dynamic, not static. It evolves with context. This evolution continues indefinitely. There is no endpoint, only ongoing refinement. Such a system resists tyranny and chaos alike. It absorbs pressure without breaking. It adapts without losing identity. Humanity's participation secures this resilience. Participation requires awareness. Awareness demands presence. Presence anchors choice. Choice shapes outcome. Outcome informs system. The loop remains. What changes is scale of responsibility. As humanity's impact grows, so does its role in regulation. This responsibility cannot be deferred. It manifests through daily decisions. Consumption, communication, creation. Each choice signals alignment. Alignment feeds back. The blueprint becomes lived rather than theorized. In this lived state, metaphysical debates lose urgency. Function supersedes belief. The unseen conflict persists, but it no longer dominates narrative. It integrates into background dynamics. What emerges is not utopia, but sustainability. Sustainability is enough. It allows continuity, and continuity allows growth. That is the final transformation. Not an ending, but a stable way forward. What remains after continuity replaces conquest is a quieter understanding of power. Power no longer announces itself through spectacle or dominance. It operates through influence so subtle it feels like choice. This subtlety once enabled manipulation. Now it enables responsibility. Humanity's long exposure to unseen pressure refined perception. Patterns once attributed to fate reveal feedback. Systems once believed immutable show responsiveness. The realization does not arrive as revelation. It settles gradually, like eyes adjusting to low light. In this adjusted state, humans recognize that participation was never optional. Even disengagement shaped outcomes. Neutrality proved illusory. Every action and every inaction contributed signal. The system listened regardless. This listening defines the architecture more accurately than any myth. Reality responds, not morally, not emotionally, functionally. Coherence stabilizes response. Fragmentation amplifies disturbance. The unseen conflict, reframed through this lens, loses narrative gravity. It no longer represents a war to be won, but a dynamic to be managed. Pressure persists because pressure is instructive. Without it, awareness dulls. The error was never conflict itself, but asymmetry. When one side exploited while the other remained unaware, imbalance grew. Awareness restores symmetry. Symmetry stabilizes exchange. This stabilization alters how humanity perceives responsibility. Responsibility ceases to mean burden. It becomes capacity. The capacity to influence outcome consciously. Capacity invites stewardship. Stewardship replaces ownership. Ownership implies control. Stewardship implies care. Care recalibrates intention. Intention shapes behavior. Behavior generates consequence. Consequences no longer appear random. Patterns emerge. Feedback clarifies. Learning accelerates. This acceleration does not lead to chaos. It leads to refinement. Systems become sensitive. Errors register early. Correction occurs gently. Gentle correction contrasts sharply with historical resets. Floods, collapses, extinctions. Those were blunt instruments. They compensated for lack of awareness. Awareness renders such instruments unnecessary. When feedback is received promptly, adjustment precedes collapse. This responsiveness marks the system's preferred state. It conserves energy. It preserves diversity. It supports continuity. Continuity, once feared as stagnation, reveals itself as living motion. Motion without rupture. Change without annihilation. Humanity's role stabilizes within this motion. Not as ruler, not as subject, as participant. Participation requires humility. Not submission, but recognition of interdependence. No action exists in isolation. No choice lacks ripple. Ripple awareness tempers impulse. It encourages foresight. Foresight supports sustainability. Sustainability emerges as central value not because it is virtuous, but because it is viable. Systems that exhaust collapse. Systems that regenerate persist. Persistence replaces triumph as success metric. Triumph exhausts itself. Persistence adapts. This reframing dissolves apocalyptic fixation. Endings lose allure. Futures open. Open futures resist manipulation. Certainty enables control. Openness requires engagement. Engagement grounded in presence resists abstraction. Abstraction facilitated domination by disconnecting action from consequence. Reconnection restores proportion. Grand narratives shrink. Immediate contexts regain relevance. Local action becomes meaningful again. Not because it saves the world, but because it aligns system feedback locally. Local alignment scales organically. This scaling bypasses centralized command. It spreads through imitation, not enforcement. Success attracts replication. Replication based on lived benefit outcompetes replication based on ideology. Bodies recognize nourishment. Minds follow. The unseen conflict adapts reluctantly. Its strategies depend on distance between cause and effect. Reconnection shortens that distance. Short distances reduce leverage. Influence becomes advisory rather than directive. This advisory role aligns with original architecture. The system was never meant to be tyrannical. Tyranny emerged through asymmetry. As symmetry restores, influence rebalances. Pressure informs rather than extracts. This informs humanity's understanding of ethics. Ethics cease to be imposed codes. They become emergent properties of coherence. Coherent systems generate trust. Trust enables collaboration. Collaboration amplifies capability. Capability wielded without awareness destroys. Capability guided by awareness builds. The difference lies not in technology or knowledge, but in integration. Integration harmonizes elements previously siloed. Science reconnects with ethics. Economy reconnects with ecology. Technology reconnects with embodiment. These reconnections appear across domains independently. Their convergence signals maturation. Maturation does not eliminate conflict. It contextualizes it. Disagreement persists without dehumanization. Tension informs without escalating. This moderation frustrates those seeking absolute answers. Yet absolutes were always simplifications. Complexity handled gracefully becomes strength. Complexity avoided becomes liability. The blueprint anticipated complexity. It embedded flexibility. Humanity activates that flexibility through awareness. Awareness alone is insufficient without practice. Practice grounds insight. Insight guides practice. This reciprocity sustains alignment. The final misunderstanding dissolves here. The belief that humanity's story was about escape from the system. It was always about inhabiting it skillfully. Skill develops through feedback. Feedback requires engagement. Engagement requires presence. Presence anchors choice. Choice shapes reality. Reality responds. The loop remains open. The unseen conflict, once framed as adversarial, integrates as constraint. Constraints define creative space. They enable form. Without constraint, expression dissipates. With constraint, expression focuses. Humanity's creative capacity flourishes within these boundaries. Art, culture, and innovation expand. Expansion no longer seeks domination. It seeks resonance. Resonance sustains connection. Connection preserves coherence. The system stabilizes not through force, but through mutual responsiveness. This mutuality extends beyond humanity. It includes ecosystems, technologies, and unseen dynamics. Interdependence becomes evident. Recognition of interdependence fosters care. Care informs stewardship. Stewardship sustains viability. Viability ensures continuity. Continuity allows growth. Growth remains open-ended. There is no final revelation, no ultimate victory, no closing chapter. There is only ongoing participation. Participation grounded in awareness. Awareness exercised through choice. Choice honored through consequence. Consequence integrated through learning. Learning embodied as wisdom. Wisdom expressed as care. Care sustaining the system. The blueprint fulfills itself not by ending, but by functioning. And in functioning, it remains alive.